sweet. Very sweet. Okay. Shabbat Shalom. Chapter. Okay, so let's see here. When we start, just so you can be ready, whenever that is, we are in Numbers chapter 11, and we're going to start at verse 18, which is kind of in the middle. 11:18 of Numbers. So just so you're ready when we get to that moment. In like a half hour. So, okay, here we go. V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat Bein Yuven v'nei Yisrael Oti le'olam Oti le'olam V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat le'darotam berit olam Yisheshet yamim asa Adonai asa Adonai es hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz v'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasod et ha-Shabbat le'darotam berit olam Ubayom hashvi Shabbat v'inafash Shabbat v'inafash Shabbat v'inafash V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat Lasot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam berit olam Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei b'riah yafeh. Amen. L'chaim. Okay. Good Shabbos, everyone. Torah portion is called V'halotecha, third Torah portion in the book of Numbers. And some great stuff here. Numbers is a lot of fun. There really are some great stories in this book of the Torah. Next week, we have Shalach Lecha, my bar mitzvah portion, which was about the spies that we'll get to. And you see that throughout the book of Numbers, there are a variety of challenges to Moses. There's Korach, there's the spies, and there are these two guys in this week's Torah portion who seem like they might be a challenge, although Moses has a different take on it, named Eldad and Medad. And so we're going to look at the story of who they are. And then we have the very famous incident with Moses, Miriam, and Aaron, and how that resolves in some very harsh consequences. And what we're taking a look at today is the relationship between the characters. There's some really interesting connections and relationships between the characters. So I just want to point out before we get into it who the main characters are. So obviously Moses and his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam. Now, the dynamic between Moses, Aaron, and Miriam is a little bit similar to maybe the dynamic between Michael and Fredo.
Was he in the boat?
In that, Moses is the youngest. And Aaron gets passed over. And the Don, Hashem, didn't think he had it. He had other talents. He's no Tom Hagen. But, you ever see The Godfather? It's a movie. All right. So, Moses is the youngest, Miriam is the middle child, and Aaron is the oldest. But Moses is in charge. So that presents itself a bit of a weird dynamic, considering Miriam was the one who saved his life. And did a lot for him. And considering that Moses is a terrible speaker, because he had that lisp problem, the speech defect, and Aaron had to speak for him. They've done a lot for him, but yet he's on a higher plane, and what is he doing? What signifies that he's on a higher plane? He's always gone. And where is he? Talking to God. And they're not always in on those conversations, which is annoying for them probably because they are prophets too. They also have experiences where they talk to God, but they're not in the highest level meetings. They're only in certain meetings. At the same time, there's another prophet on the scene whose name is Joshua. Joshua is also a prophet. There's a book called Joshua. You don't have a book if you're not a prophet, usually. So Joshua is a prophet as well, but he's also not really involved in the conversations. There's another character involved. This one, the Torah doesn't mention by name. You have to go to Rashi to find it. But just to give it away for a second so that we understand what we're talking about, the other character who's mentioned here according to Rashi is? Well, not her. Also, she's important, but not the one that I was thinking about. We're going to get to her. Gershom. Who's Gershom? Moses' son. And so there is an interesting question about who's going to take over from Moses. Aaron thinks maybe it'll be me. Miriam thinks the Jewish people are ready for a female leader. Right? She was like the Golda Meir of this scenario. Gershom wonders, do I get it automatically because I'm the son? Joshua wonders, I'm the number one guy. I'm the assistant. I'm the one who follows Moses around. Gershom's out playing lacrosse, and I'm the one that's here with Moses. Right? So there's a lot going on here about who's who. And it comes to a head in this Torah portion. Now, the name of the Torah portion, Bahalotecha, you hear Oleh in there, Aliyah, right? Who's going to be the one that goes up? See that? It's a very interesting Torah portion. All right, so let's start with verse, Norman, yes. Oh, yeah, that's right. Sometimes I forget how from you guys are. Now, I've already studied this morning, so I did it already. But let's join together. That's a joke. Although I did. But let's join together for the blessing. Baruch atah Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Amen. so, the truth is you only get reward for every letter of Torah you study once you say the blessing. So everything that we just discussed, you're not going to get. I will, because I already said the blessing this morning. I studied some Talmud beforehand, so I'm good. I'm fine. The rest of you. All right. Well, we'll start gaining reward for Torah study now. Beginning with chapter 11, verse 18. Not that we do it for the reward, but it's nice work if you can get it. All right. Verse 18. Here we go.
And say to the people, purify yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have kept whining before the Eternal and saying, if only we had meat to eat. Indeed, we were better off in Egypt. The Eternal will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, not 2, not even 5 days, or 10 or 20, but a whole month, until it comes running out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. For you have rejected the Eternal who is among you by whining before God and saying, oh, why did we ever leave Egypt? But Moses said, the people who are with me number 600,000 foot soldiers. Yet you say, I will give them enough meat to eat for a whole month. Could enough flocks and herds be slaughtered to suffice them? Or could all the fish of the sea be gathered for them to suffice them? And the Eternal answered Moses, is there a limit to the Eternal's power? You shall soon see whether what I have said happens to you or not. Moses went out and reported the words of the Eternal to the people. He gathered 70 of the people's elders and stationed them around the tent. Then, after coming down in a cloud and speaking to him, the Eternal drew upon the spirit that was on him and put it upon the 70 representative elders. And when the spirit rested upon them, they spoke in ecstasy, but did not continue.
Okay, now, a lot of this is explained in Rashi. What an elder is. So the elders were chosen from the overseers in Egypt. We've talked about this before. But the elders were the overseers in Egypt who were given the job of whipping the Jews in order to get them to produce this certain amount of bricks that they needed, the quota of bricks, but they refused to do it. So then when the Egyptian overseers came and they said, how come the bricks aren't done? They whipped the Jewish overseers to punish them for not whipping the Jews, the slaves for producing enough bricks. So they took the beatings on behalf of the other Jews, and that elevated them to be considered an elder amongst the people. Now, when they needed a certain amount of those people, however many there may have been, they needed 70. The reason why they needed 70, according to the rabbis, there were supposed to be six from each tribe. Well, there's supposed to be 70, which would even out to 6 from each tribe minus 2. So that meant that 2 tribes were only going to have 5. And Moses went around to each of the tribes and said, would you be willing to have 5 instead of 6? They all said no. Could you imagine, Virginia? Would you be willing to go to 1 senator? No. Okay. Hawaii. Nobody even knows what you're doing anyway. How about we just give you 1 senator? No. Nobody's... So what did Moses do? He took lots. He took and he took 72 lots because he said, all right, every tribe send me 6. So they sent 6. And he took 72 lots. And on 70 of them, he wrote elder. And on 2 of them, he left them blank. And he said, pick one. Everyone picked one. So 2 guys got blank ones. Their names were Eldad and Medad. Now, that means that they were eligible to prophesy. They had the spiritual capability to be prophets, but they weren't chosen to do it. All of this story that I told you is from the Midrash. Rashi brings it. You can take it or leave it. The point, however, though, when you see who they are and that they're prophesying in the Torah, it helps make the story make a little bit more sense. So what you have then, as we get now to, where do we get to? As we get down to 26, the 70 elders have left to go do whatever Moses needed them to do. But the two of them remain behind. So you could ask the question, who are the two that remained behind? The rabbi's answer to you is the two who got the lost that had nothing on it. Now, there's a lot more to this story. It's ironic that the two who got left behind, who just happened to pull ones that said that were blank, had similar names, Eldad and Medad. Now, it could have been that all 72 of them, maybe there was Joe Dodd and Boris Dodd, and they all happen to end in Dodd, but I doubt it. Now, if you know the word Dodd in Hebrew, it sounds a little bit like Dod. Dod means good, uncle. So then there's a story on that in the Midrash. And this is what you call a Midrashic rabbit hole. So one of the things that happened at Mount Sinai was they got the rules about who could be married to who. So let's say you were married to a distant cousin, and then new rules come into play. And the Torah says you're not allowed to have those kinds of connections in marriage. People had to get divorced at Mount Sinai. So there are a lot of people who had weird family relationships having to do with uncles and things. And so the fact that their names were Eldad and Medad means that probably they were part of that in some way. Now, this goes back, there's a midrash that goes back to say that Amram, who was Moses' father, separated at one point from his wife, and had, because they were like distant relatives and they weren't supposed to be married, and he had kids with another woman. Those kids, Eldad and Medad. What does that mean? Eldad and Medad are Moses' half-brothers. Some of the rabbis come and say that's preposterous. The ages don't work out. And it doesn't make any sense. Who knows? Like I've told you before, all the video that we have is grainy and it's hard to tell who's who. But what we can see is that the fact that both of their names are uncles and the rabbis pick up on that means that there's something a little weird going on with who was married to who and so forth. And so maybe it's not so unusual that Dod was added to people's names. I don't want to really get into that. It'll take us in a whole different direction. But now we get to these two guys, and it's a very interesting story. They've remained behind. Everyone else went with Moses to do what they do. And now there's this little story about these two guys. So that's where we're up to now, verse 26.
Two of the representatives, one named Eldad and the other Medad, had remained in camp. Yet the Spirit rested upon them. They were among those recorded, but they had not gone out to the tent. And they spoke in ecstasy in the camp. An assistant ran out and told Moses, saying, Eldad and Medad are acting the prophet in the camp.
Okay, now, I don't know what speaking in ecstasy means from the Hebrew. The Hebrew word is vayitnabu. Vayitnabu. Now, you know the phrase Tanakh?
Yeah.
What's the N? What's the N? Good. Nevi'im, which means prophet. Vayitnabu is the reflexive of that verb, to prophesy. It's a verb. I mean, it's conjugated. Vayitnabu is these two guys, plural, are in the process of having a prophetic experience. Now, if you want to translate that speaking in ecstasy, fine, but the root of the word is navi, is nabeh. By the way, lehit nabeh in modern Hebrew, to predict.
My translation says to prophesy in the camp.
So does mine. So does mine. So I'm just pointing out that prophesy is a more, I think, fair understanding of what the Hebrew says. Okay. And to speak in ecstasy could bring you down another track. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're having a connection with God. It could mean that you just, you know, ate a, you know, you thought, you know, the manna tasted like whatever you thought it was. So if you wanted it to be pizza, it tasted like pizza. If you wanted it to be, I said this to a kid this week. He said, "They had pizza back then?" I said, "No." Although I can't blame him, because a couple of weeks ago I told him that, you know, the three sons of Levi, Kahat, Gershom, and Merari, that Merari was the Italian cousin. So now I see where he got it. There's a whole Italian theme running through the book of Numbers. What was the point of that?
Speaking in ecstasy.
Yeah, so maybe you were thinking that when you were eating the manna, it tasted like psychedelic mushrooms, and that's what they were. That's not it. They were actually having a conversation with God. Okay, now, they prophesy in the camp. Verse 27, a new character that you don't know who it is. This is fascinating. Watch this. Edith?
And Joshua,
Verse 27.
27, and an assistant ran out and told Moses, saying, Eldad and Medad are acting the prophet in the camp.
Okay, so if you look on the back of the source sheet, the Da'at Zakanim were Rashi's students. They were the Tosafot, and the name of their, if you look on a page of Talmud, in the middle of the page is the main text. On one side is Rashi, and on the other side are his students called the Tosafot. Well, those Tosafot who wrote commentary on the Talmud also wrote commentary on the Torah. Their commentary on the Torah is called Da'at Zakanim. So what they write here, the lad ran. Who's that lad? Who's this assistant? Who's this young man?
Oh.
Moses' son Gershom. So now, inserted into this, we have Moses. We have Joshua, which we're about to get to, and Miriam, which we're about to get to. We're going to have Eldad and Medad, who are maybe doing a different type of leadership. And inserted as well as Gershom, who says, "What about me? Maybe I should be a leader." And he runs in. He is the one who seems to have Moses' back. He's really just a tattletale. And says, these two guys, Eldad and Medad, are prophesying in the camp, to which Joshua says the following, verse 28.
And Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant from his youth, spoke up and said, My Lord Moses, restrain them.
Right, now the Hebrew there is kilaim. Anyone know how to say jail in Hebrew? Keleh. Or Beit Keleh. But Keleh, jail. You could also say Beit Sohar, but a Keleh is a jail. This word here, the last Hebrew word in verse 28, kilaim, means to restrain them in a way that they're placed in custody. Okay? To remand them and force them to, have the fingerprints and the mugshot despite their position in the society. That's just what it says. That's just what it says. These are prophets. They have, their own. Okay. You're on the campaign? Whatever. All right. 29. Verse 29.
But Moses said to him, Are you wrought up on my account? Would that all Adonai's people were prophets, that Adonai put the divine spirit upon them. Moses then re-entered the camp together with the elders of Israel. A wind from Adonai started up, swept quail from the sea, and strewed them over the camp, about a day's journey on this side and about a day's journey on that side, all around the camp, and some 2 cubits deep on the ground. The people set to gathering quail all that day and night and all the next day. Even the one who gathered least had 10 chomers. and they spread them out all around the camp. The meat was still between their teeth, not yet chewed, when the anger of Adonai blazed forth against the people, and Adonai struck the people with a very severe plague. That place was named Kibroth Hatava, because the people who had the craving were buried there.
Okay. Okay, let's look at verse 29 for a second. Okay. Well, which verse are you looking at?
You're ahead of the game.
Having trouble with this mic. Sorry if you're at home. I don't know what's going on. Okay, so what happens here in this chapter is it starts off with huge complaints, and we have 20-some verses about complaints about food. And then, when Moses says in verse 23, you don't think God can, fix this and make up. And Moses is really having trouble with the people. As a leader, he's having trouble relating to the people. And he's just in shock. And he's saying to them, you don't think God's going to handle the food issue? You're worried about this again? Once Moses reacts to their problems with the food, you have this seeming insertion, of the story of Eldad and Medad, in which we also see Gershom and Joshua. Then, that ends. And Moses says, okay, so they're prophesying outside the camp. I wish all of Jews would talk to God in such a way. And that ends. And as soon as that ends, we come back to the original story, and God blows a wind and the food comes. And it looks like, and if you were at the Hebrew Union College and you had a professor with 3 PhDs from Harvard who wanted to convince you that the Torah was written by people and not by God, he would then say to you, someone put this story in the middle later on. Okay. You could believe that. And what that means is that the story looks like it's going along just fine, and you don't need this whole thing with Eldad and Medad. They complained, Moses said, you think this is too much for God? Next thing you know, a wind blows and the food comes. And that's the story. But it looks that someone cut and pasted from somewhere else and superimposed or juxtaposed onto this story this whole situation here. And that's a good way of looking at it. That's what you call literary analysis. What I would prefer to do, again, admitting I wasn't there when Moses wrote it. So I didn't see him write it, although one of my relatives was there. But we don't have, yours too. All of you. So I would prefer to think that instead of just telling the story of what happened, this section of Torah is crafted in a way to teach us a lesson. Because the truth is, it doesn't really matter what happened for us. Who cares what they ate? What matters for us is 3,500 years later, what do we learn? How does it help us in our life? And so the question is, why is this story here? What does it add in terms of pedagogical narrative that we can learn from? Then, once you learn that, you can say, who cares how it was written? Here's the message that we were meant to learn. If you want to believe it was written all by Moses, fine. If you don't, fine, whatever. As long as you're willing to learn the lesson. Okay, so the lesson, the first thing I want to show you, the Orach Chaim, 1700s, Morocco, who made Aliyah, and built a synagogue in the old city of Jerusalem, which is still there. You can visit. You see what the Orach Chaim says on the middle of the back page on 1129. Now that God had shown he had granted prophetic insights directly to two more Israelites, meaning Eldad and Medad, he could only hope that God would grant such prophetic insights to everybody. None of such additional prophetic insights would be a denial or diminution of Moses' own stature as a prophet. So from Moses' point of view, when his son Gershom runs in tattletales and says, look, those guys think they should be the leader. Look what they're doing. We all know that it goes to the son anyway. Right? That's Gershom when it comes to tattletale. Joshua then comes in and says, well, I'm probably going to be the next leader. You see those guys over there who think they're going to be leaders? Put them in jail. Moses' response to Gershom and Joshua is, who cares about who the leader is? Wouldn't it be great if every Jew spoke to God and knew what to do? We wouldn't need a leader because everyone would be doing exactly what God told them all the time. That would be preferable. To which Gershom and Joshua probably looked at each other and said, yeah, so here's Moses says, I'm yearning for the day when every Jew will talk to God and do exactly what they're supposed to all the time. This is, meanwhile, all the Jews are about to revolt because they're sick of eating the same food every day. Gershom and Joshua look at each other and say, what is this guy talking about? You think that's going to happen? Look who you're talking about. So there's a question of leadership here. Now, once all that is done, and we finish this question of leadership, and the food comes, we have one of the most incredible events of the whole Torah with Miriam and Aaron. In chapter 12. So let's see what happens now to chapter 12, and then what I want to try to do is relate this story of what Miriam and Aaron do back to Eldad, Medad, Gershom, and Joshua. Primarily one of those four, which I don't want to give it away yet. Okay. Everyone clear so far what we're doing? Okay. All right, so now let's enter chapter 12, verse 1. Judy.
When they were in Hazeroth, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married. He married a Cushite woman. They said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? The Lord heard it. Now Moses was a very humble man, more so than any other man on earth. Suddenly the Lord called to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. So the three of them went out. The Lord came down in a pillar of cloud, stopped at the entrance of the tent, and called out, Aaron and Miriam. The two of them came forward, and he said, hear these my words. When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is trusted throughout my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord. How then did you not shrink from speaking against my servant Moses? Still incensed with them, the Lord departed.
Okay. Now, if you look at verse 4, Hashem said, or God said suddenly to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, you three. Now, what that indicates is, when Miriam and Aaron were gossiping about Moses, they were with him. All three were standing together. And they still did it. They didn't do it behind his back. They did it in front of his back. That's amazing. It's an amazing idea. Now, I want to show you a couple, first of all, the Rashbam. So if you look at the center of the first page of the sheet, there's a question about, Moses lived to 120. Right? That's why we say Ad Mea Vesrim. May you live to 120. So the first 40 years, we know he lived in the palace. The last 40 years we know, he was with the Jews wandering in the wilderness. And then he died at the end. So a good question is, what did he do the middle 40 years? Well, what was he doing the whole time? So the Rashbam has an amazing idea. Rashbam is the grandson of Rashi. Grandson of Rashi. Okay, so Ken, would you mind reading the Rashbam? Moses ruled for 40 years. So look at this incredible idea on what Moses did the middle 40 years of his life.
Moses ruled for 40 years as king over the land of Cush.
Right, now what's Cush? Basically, the area that was Ethiopia. Now, do you remember Noah had 3 sons? Shem, Japheth, and Ham. Ham was black-skinned, or his ancestors were black-skinned. We see that later in the Bible, which, if you refer back to, I mentioned this in a High Holy Day sermon at one point when I was talking about slave owners in this country. We talked about how there's a mention of, the Europeans in the New Testament conquering the Hamites and subjugating them. And the Hamites meant the Africans. But Hamites, who's Ham? Ham's a descendant of Noah. So it's possible, I don't remember, my New Testament is exceedingly weak, but I can look back, I quoted the verses from the New Testament, or maybe it's even in the Old Testament, I forget, but it was something that the slave owners used to love, and they would, talk about it all the time. But it's these Hamites who were the son of Noah that perhaps Moses went and found and was living with those middle 40 years of his life. And so when he married a Cushite woman, he took a woman from where he was living. Maybe. This is the Rashbam. But let's see what he says.
Let's see. Moses.
Would you mind starting from the beginning?
Yeah, Moses ruled for 40 years as king over the land of Cush, took himself a woman as his queen, but never slept with her, as reported there. Miriam and Aaron were never aware of the fact that Moses had not consummated that union. This is the plain meaning of our verse. If, as some believe, Miriam and Aaron spoke about Moses and Zipporah, what need was there for the Torah to describe Moses' wife as Cushite, Isha Cushite, when everyone is well aware that Moses married Zipporah, the daughter of Yitro, who was a Midianite, not a Cushite? Zipporah could not have been described as Cushite, seeing that the Cushites are descended from Ham, and the Midianites are descended from the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine, who bore 6 sons for him, one of them being Midian.
Right, remember Rashi said that Keturah was Hagar.
Right.
There's a debate about that, but that's Rashi's opinion.
Rashbam's argument is tenuous, for if Keturah was the same person as Hagar, according to most commentators, seeing that Hagar was an Egyptian, a woman descended from her could be described as Cushite, seeing that Mitzrayim, Egypt, was a descendant of Ham.
Okay, now that's just one view. The Ibn Ezra, if you look below, has a totally different view, which is unbelievable. You look at all these different views and you say, we really don't know. We really don't know why she's called a Cushite woman. One view is that maybe that's who Moses married the time that he was in Cush. Look what Ibn Ezra says, a totally different view.
I believe that the Cushite woman is to be identified with Zipporah, for Zipporah was a Midianite. The Midianites are Ishmaelites, and they live in tents.
Like what? Ishmaelites? What are you talking about? Why does he think that? Because they lived in tents. Look what he said.
Scripture similarly writes, "The curtains of the land of Midian do tremble. Because of the sun, they do not have any whiteness at all. Zipporah was black and was like a Cushite."
Right, because they didn't live in structures, they only lived in tents, so she got a little more sun. So her skin was darker. So, we don't know. We don't know. this is a problem. I brought one more view. If you look on the back page, the Bechor Shor. The Bechor Shor is 12th century, from the same school as the Dad Zakanim, which means he's also one of the rabbis of the Tosafot. By the way, most of those rabbis from the Tosafot were French. This is a period of, that's where Rashi was living, in that French-Prussian area. He lived in a city called Troyes, Troyes, about an hour and a half south of Paris. If you go there, there's a plaque, like a big memorial, and it says on it, Rashi. So if you want to go there, you'll see that. Nothing else, just that. Right. And it's very moving. It's very moving. Okay. The Bechor Shor. Would you just give it to one too, Ken?
According to the simple meaning, they were saying, and did Moses not find a woman from the children of Israel to take as a wife, that he went to take one from the daughters of Cush, who are uncircumcised? And it was because the Holy One, blessed be he, spoke with him, that he became haughty, such that he not want to marry a woman from the daughters of Israel, and sought a woman from far away? Did he not also speak with us, and we married from within Israel, and did not become haughty about this?
Okay, so this is a different take on why Miriam was gossiping, and it's very interesting, and I think it bears out, if you study everything that we did, coming from chapter 11 into chapter 12, and all the story about Eldad and Medad, and Gershom and Joshua. What does Gershom do? Gershom tattletales on Eldad and Medad. How dare they prophesy? Did they think? By the way, according to the Midrash, and Rashi brings it out, I didn't bring this Rashi, but one of the things that Eldad and Medad are prophesying was that Aaron and Moses were going to die and not lead us into the land of Israel, which, by the way, they were right. That was a true prophecy that they got. Now, what was sinful about that is you're not supposed to say things like that in the presence of Moses and Aaron. And it got back to them, and that annoyed Gershom. But it really probably annoyed Gershom because Gershom was saying, yeah, they're going to die in the wilderness, but you think you're taking over? I'm taking over. I'm the son. Joshua then says, hold my coffee. Right. You think you're taking over? You think you're taking over? Right. I'm the prize student. I'm the one who learns with Moses all day while you're out doing whatever it is you're doing with your brother. I'm the one. Now, while all that is going on, Miriam turns to Aaron and says, look at this woman he took. So, the traditional understanding of that, what was Miriam really saying about Zipporah, is what Rashi says. But I want to show you what Rashi says because it's the classic text. But then I want to go back to the Bechor Shor because what the Bechor Shor says, it takes it to another level. And by the way, this is what I do with my 7th graders. When they come for a bar mitzvah, and I tell them that we're about to study Torah, I have a whole PowerPoint on it. It's really cool. I use Google Earth and stuff. It's hard to keep their attention. So I show them, listen, the goal of your speech at your bar mitzvah is to see how this Torah affects your life. Now, the first thing we need to do is go through the entire Talmud and see all the places in the Talmud where your Torah portion is mentioned. And I tell them it's going to take us, there's 7,000 pages in the Talmud. You're going to have to come 3-4 hours a night. They look at me like I'm crazy, and then they look at their parents like I'm not doing that, and they say, don't. And then I always say this, don't worry. Because I'm such good friends with your parents, I arranged with them that I'd be willing to do this for you. And all the light sucked out. But because I want to make a point. And the point is we don't have to do that because Rashi did all the work for us. Then I explained to them who Rashi is. I said, all we have to do is read the Torah with Rashi. He went through the whole Talmud in the Midrash and took out everywhere. Fine, so we have that. But then, all the other rabbis who came after Rashi started with Rashi because he was the first one to do it. So you start with Rashi. And then you go, every 100 years or so, there's a different rabbi who says, here's what Rashi says. And based on what Rashi says, you know what that looks like? from me living in the 12th century. And the next guy says, based on Rashi and what they said in the 12th century, you know how that looks here from the 13th century? And I told them, all the rabbis, and I said, okay, now we're at the 20th century. It's your turn to add your voice. That's the point of studying Torah. And then hopefully it becomes more meaningful to them. What I want to do is look at the basic Rashi, why we start with Rashi, because he's the first one who did it. He's the first one who had the idea. Let's gather it all together and put it down on paper. But then go back to the Bechor Shor and see how it built. So, Annabelle, would you mind reading the Rashi on the top of the page? And Miriam and Aaron spake. Spake means spoke. Spake means spoke. It's Aramaic. Spake is Aramaic for spoke.
I'm sorry, what is it that you want me to read?
The very top. The first Rashi on 12.
The Hoshor?
No, the Rashi on 12:1.
Ah.
And Miriam and Aaron spake.
And Miriam and Aaron spake. She opened the conversation, therefore, Scripture mentions her first. And whence did Miriam know that Moses had separated himself from his wife? For this was the statement she made. Compare Rashi below. Rav Nathan answered, Miriam was beside Zipporah when it was told to Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. When Zipporah heard this, she explained, woe to the wives of these, if they have anything to do with prophecy, for they will separate from their wives, just as my husband has separated from me.
Okay, so here's the crux of this. At Mount Sinai, God told the Jews, men and women separate because you need to be pure, because tomorrow you're going to hear from God. And Moses said, really? When you speak to God, you can't have any contact with women in order to be able to receive what God's telling you? I speak with God every day. And at that point, he said, I need to separate from my wife. And he did. So Miriam didn't really appreciate that because she saw Zipporah basically now separated. And here's Eldad and Medad prophesying. And the first thing Miriam thinks is, I feel sorry for their wives. That's the traditional story. That's the traditional view.
Is that where the separation comes from? Mm-hmm. Men and women?
Well, yeah, so, men aren't allowed to have contact with women who aren't their wives, but never during their cycle, because you could become impure. And then so that's why at Mount Sinai, God said that this is in the Torah, men and women had to separate for 3 days. So we don't have that problem in Reform Judaism, but in traditional Judaism, that's an issue.
Separation in shul, is this the genesis of why men pray?
No, that's because if men see women, they lose focus on anything else. And so they need to... But that's not the tradition. Yeah.
Isn't this verse though basically kind of the way I see it, saying if someone's prophesying in the village, but your wife is a part of your prophecy, like she knows what's happening, and you go and try to prophesy without her and leave her, maybe she's a strong part of your prophecy. Stay with her.
That was an interesting idea. It's not why Moses does it according to the Torah.
Right.
By the way, there are 3 things that Moses does in his life that God didn't tell him to do. But the Gemara says God approved of it. One of the others was smashing the 10 Commandments. In fact, Rashi ends his commentary on the whole Torah at the end of Deuteronomy by saying, Yasher kol sheshibarta. Right? It was you did the right thing when you broke the 10 Commandments.
Just a quick question. Is it one-sided? I mean, Miriam's a prophet. Does that mean she separates from her husband?
Not that we know of. It's an interesting question. But she doesn't talk to God every day. I mean, she talked to God maybe a couple times. Moses all day long, talking to God. Why is he talking to God all day long? Because people are bringing him court cases and he doesn't know the answer. Moses is Supreme Court. Remember in Yitro, he appoints all these other judges. And they all handle the easy cases. The hard cases that nobody knows, they come to Moses. Moses says, I don't know. So goes to God. He says, what do I do about this? But he needs to be ready to talk to God every day because he's the Supreme Court. Okay. So back to the Bechor Shor on the back page. According to the simple meaning, and Moses did not find a woman from the children of Israel to take as a wife, that he went to take one from the daughters of Cush who were uncircumcised. What Miriam is really gossiping about, according to the Bechor Shor, is not only that Moses isn't doing a good thing with his wife, in that he's separated from her, or at least she's not really even saying that. She's not really even saying that he didn't do the right thing. She's just saying, I feel bad for Tzipporah. Which seems like that doesn't seem like such a sin. Right? What's wrong with feeling bad for her? She got a raw deal. Miriam recognizes that. That's really amazing. To have this kind of feeling this long ago, that kind of sensitivity is really incredible. By the way, there's some really other amazingly humanly sensitive things that go on in this Torah portion. We don't have time to get into all of it, but very interesting stuff, including the way the Torah portion starts out with Aaron lighting the lamps. There's a whole message there. But we're in the third triennial cycle, so I can't comment on something in the first triennial cycle. I need it for next year. I need it for next year. But this time next year, you're going to love it. So if that's not really that big a deal, there's another deal, I think, that's even bigger, but you can't understand it unless you go back to what we learned with Eldad, Medad, Gershom, and Joshua. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit of just what I think, and you can take it or leave it, but I think you're going to see it's compelling when I show you one more piece of evidence that will hopefully knock your socks off, like it did to me. And I never knew this until this week. I learned this only this week, and I was blown away by it. I think you will be too. So, Miriam sees let's go back to the context of what all of this is. The context is Moses is the leader, and it's not going very well. Everyone's out back screaming and crying, and they're hating everything. We're about to have Korach, who's their cousin, come and try to take over everything. The spies are not going to be able to give a good report. The people are going to turn their back, basically, on Moses and God and say, we don't even want to go to the land of Israel now because of what the spies said, and they don't listen to Joshua, they don't listen to Caleb, they only listen to the majority of the leadership's not going very well. Meanwhile, there's a real challenge to Moses' leadership, and people are starting to wonder who's going to be. There are two other guys outside prophesying in front of everybody, which they shouldn't have been doing. And at the same time, Joshua and Gershom are saying, hey, I'm going to be the next leader. Meanwhile, Moses and Aaron are not dead. They're right here. And Miriam said, after all of that takes place, Miriam brings up the story of the Cushite woman. But according to the Bechor Shor, who's taking this from the Midrash, Bechor Shor says, why does Miriam say that? Because she's pointing out Moses didn't take a woman. He doesn't care about it. The Bechor Shor doesn't, he's not worried about Zipporah's feelings at the moment. I mean, I'm sure he is, but he lived 2,000 years later, so he's over it. But he's saying that's not what that's not her intention here. Her intention of gossiping with Aaron about Moses in his presence was probably something along the lines of saying, Moses, you live in a different world than we do. You're with God. Fine. You're brilliant. Fine. But you don't relate to us. We don't get you. When you tell us this food that rains down from heaven is so great, and it's a miracle, the rest of us are saying this stuff again. Couldn't you pull over at a food court? Give us a little variety, something. I've been on a lot of Israel trips. You're driving through the Negev or driving through the Golan, and you don't see anything, and all of a sudden you pop up to a little mall that has a McDonald's, an Aroma, and a Chinese place. And it's an oasis from heaven, you know, and usually like a gelato place, you know, and it's all kosher. I mean, you can't believe your luck, right? So Miriam is saying, you relate so poorly to us and to those who were slaves, you wouldn't even marry one of us. You had to marry someone who wasn't a Jew. And that's literally what the Bechor Shor says. He says, look what it says. And did Moses not find a woman from the children of Israel to take as a wife? What she's saying there is, were the Jews not good enough for you? You couldn't find a wife amongst us? That you had to go and take one from the daughters of Cush, who are uncircumcised, meaning non-Jews, people who aren't in the covenant? You know, are you so much better than us? And on a different plane and level than us? To which the Torah's response is, Miriam, how dare you? And what does the Torah say? The only compliment that's given to Moses in the entire Torah is right here. Moshe anav me'od. Moses was the most humble. Moses was very humble. How dare you say he thinks he's better than anyone? He thinks he's the lowest of everyone. Right? Okay. Now, that being said, here's the grand finale. If you go back to chapter 11, this, I hope, will amaze you. Verse 28. Verse 28. So, when this is all said and done, our characters are Moses, Miriam, Aaron, Joshua, Gershom, Eldad, and Medad. The hero of the story, you know who the hero of the story is? You have to guess? Okay. A lot of guesses. Watch this. Watch this. Verse 28. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of Moses, since his youth, spoke up and said, my Lord, make an end to them. That's what or put them in jail, restrain them. In other words, Joshua thinks they're doing something terrible. That's clear from the verse, right? What's Moses' response to Joshua? Verse 29, Moses said to him, you're wrong. In my opinion, Joshua, you're wrong. It's good what they're doing. Everyone see that Joshua's wrong? Okay, if you look on the back of the sheet now, I want to show you two other verses from Exodus. And instead of making you search for it in the book, I brought them. All right, so if you look at Exodus 32, verses 17 and 18, this is right after the scene of the golden calf. Moses comes down the mountain, Joshua sees him, and Joshua comes up to him, and look what happens. When Joshua heard the sound of the people and its boisterousness, he said to Moses, there is a cry of war in the camp. There's a cry of war in the camp. Everyone see that? But he answered, meaning Moses, it's not the sound of the tune of triumph or the sound of the tune of defeat. It's the sound of song that I hear. This is the first time we have this. Joshua says, here's what I think. Moses says, you're wrong. In our Torah portion, Joshua says, here's what I think. Moses says, you're wrong. Everyone see that in these two cases? Now consider this. Those are the only two times in the entire Torah that Joshua speaks. Joshua only speaks two times in the whole Torah, and both times he's wrong. Both times he's wrong. Now, we're wondering who's going to, out of all this, we're wondering who's going to be the leader. His name is mentioned in other places, but he doesn't speak. These are the only two times he actually speaks. He speaks in the book of Joshua. But in the Torah, these are the only two times that he says anything. And both times he's wrong. Now, we're wondering who's going to be the next leader. Is it going to be Eldad? Is it going to be Medad? Is it going to be Gershom? Is it going to be Miriam? Is it going to be Aaron? We know that it becomes Joshua. Moses dies, Joshua takes over, leads the people of Israel. So the irony is, what does he have on his resume? He's always wrong. And he's the guy who becomes the leader. Now, why? So, what happens is this. Miriam, according to the Bechor Shor from the Midrash, Miriam's problem with Moses, not that he married a Cushite woman, it's not that he divorced Zipporah, it's that he doesn't relate well to the people, and also he's never wrong. I mean, he was wrong with the rock thing, fine, although the Gemara explains that a different way, but he's pretty much never wrong. And he doesn't relate well to the people. So here you have this guy who's never wrong. When you're never wrong, you never learn. You never learn from your mistakes. You never get, But here he is, always right, the most humble, the most perfect. He's the greatest leader ever. And the people can't relate to him at all. It's going terribly. And the whole time that Moses is a leader in the wilderness, it goes terribly. So much so that they all have to die. Everyone that he led had to die, and then to raise up a new generation who would be raised up by Joshua. So what does Joshua have that Moses doesn't? If you look at the book of Joshua, throughout the book of Joshua, is very successful. And he is the leader who is probably the most successful of all of the leaders in the Tanakh. All the rest of them have serious problems. Even King David, even King Solomon, even Samuel. There are major problems and challenges to their leadership. Not Joshua. Joshua is like the perfect leader in the book of Joshua. So what do we know about him? One, he learned from his mistakes and got better. We see that. He makes mistakes in the Torah, but by the time you get to the book of Joshua, he's a great leader. But two, he's not perfect. Because he's not perfect, when the other Jews look at him, they don't see Moses up on the hill, who they can't understand. They see Joshua, he's one of us, he relates well to us. And so the moral of the story is the two lessons we get from leadership here is you've got to be able to learn from your mistakes and improve, and you've got to be able to relate well to the people that you're leading. And all of this whole section of the Torah is meant to teach us who's going to be the next leader. Gershom, the tattletale, runs, he doesn't make it. Eldad and Medad, they're on Moses' level, they're not going to relate to the people. Miriam and Aaron, they don't have it. The only one who has it in this whole scenario is the hero, who is the one who leads the Jewish people into the land of Israel, becomes the best leader later on in the Tanakh, and that's Joshua. Okay, Shabbat Shalom.
It's a corollary to the same thing that leaders can't be so far ahead of their people and how great they are.
That would take a lot. Give it a shot. died.